is here today to talk about the social side of physical spaces in our communities. The parks, the churches, the bowling alleys, the coffee shops, and of course, near and dear to me and the Grow with Google team, the libraries. But Eric obviously thinks about all of these spaces. His book, Palaces for the People, provides a really fresh take on this sort of notion of social infrastructure and how it represents the key to safety and prosperity in 21st century urban America. It's a fascinating read, and you can pick up a copy after the talk, and I hope you do so. A little bit about Eric. He's a professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and his work has been published in numerous academic journals, as well as him being a frequent contributor to publications ranging from the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal to Rolling Stone. I will add that Eric teamed up with Aziz Ansari and co-authored a book called Modern Romance, where the two applied social science tools to better understand dating. So that is totally in bounds for the Q&A. So thank you once again to Allison McDougall-Wheel from the Ruse User Experience team, who's been instrumental in making this happen today, as well as Irini in the back there, who was critical to making all this happen. And now, Eric, on behalf of Ruse, Grow with Google, and the Google New York community, welcome. We're so happy you're here.
You can take that. Thank you for being here. I know how much you've got going on here. You're building like billions of new square feet of real estate where we speak, so you must all be very busy people in addition to your other projects. I'm actually a neighbor of yours. I live on 15th Street, so I'm very invested in what you guys do here, even though this is my third time speaking at Google. I like to visit the building, but I have to write a book in order to get in the door, so I'm working very hard on the next one already, but for the moment I'm pleased to be here. And you know, I had this kind of crazy idea, even though this is a tech place, and I knew that you would have these like amazing screens and all sorts of like technological capacities here. Well, I want to try this thing, which I've been doing recently, and I hope this is okay with you. It's a little bit weird, but I'm actually just going to talk to you for 40 minutes or so as if I were a human being. And I had a voice and a body, and you guys have voices and bodies, and we just could talk to each other. And I hope that's not too weird a thing to do here, but there's going to be no PowerPoint slides. I made them. I spent hours and hours preparing them. I'm not going to use them. And let's just try to have a conversation, if that's okay with you, right? Massive applause if you're watching on YouTube in the future. Yeah. Okay, so here's how I want to start. Have any of you guys been to the Amazon 4-star store? Do you know what I'm talking about, the 4-star store? Sound like half of you have been there. Just so you know, there's this company called Amazon. They're moving to New York City. They got a really good deal to come here. They're going to be far away in Queens, but they're going to be a big presence in New York City. But they're already kind of gaining some land here, and they've decided that in addition to having this awesome website that can get us anything in like a few hours, they also want to have more of a retail presence. And so you've probably seen that there's Amazon stores, appearing in malls and on some blocks. And just before Christmas and like the run up to the holiday season, they opened this new thing called the 4-star store. And you're probably already thinking like, wow, that sounds really awesome. I'd love to go to a 4-star store. And in case you haven't been there or don't know the concept, the idea is that this is a store in Soho. It's on Spring Street in like a very cool, busy part of the city. And they will only stock and sell things at the 4-star store that have gotten 4 stars or more from Amazon users. So you know when you're going in there that you're going to get a very high quality product that people like. And there was a big New York Times article about it when it came out, and I thought, ooh, that sounds like a kind of buzzy, neat thing. And in addition to being a neighbor of yours, I'm also a parent who's raising kids, in this area. And I don't know, you guys this is Google, everybody's young, but like, does anybody here have children? Anyone? Okay, so for those of you who have children here, there's this thing, and for those of you who are thinking about having children sometime in the future, I want to tell you there's this thing that happens, which is, on weekends, the schools won't take your kids. And so you wake up in the morning and things happen like I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I'll wake up and I'm married, and it'll be like 9 o'clock in the morning, and my wife will say things occasionally like, hey, Eric, it's such a nice day. I'm going to run out and do some errands. I'll be home around 6. And then you're in this weird situation because it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and there's screens in the house, right? But you don't want your kids on screens all the time, right? They can only be on the screens like 20 hours a day. And so you've got to find something else that the kids can do. And my 12-year-old pretty much doesn't want to be anywhere near me at this point because he's 12, and that's what you do when you're 12. So now I have like a 10-year-old, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's a weekend, and I think, okay, I've got to come up with a plan. And I just read this article, and I just published this book. And just by the way, so Palaces for the People, which is the title for the book, comes from Andrew Carnegie, and he was like the Bill Gates of a century ago, like, one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he has a kind of a mixed record as an employer and capitalist, definitely like very Gilded Age monopolist, not great to workers, did some violent and horrible things. Also great philanthropist who gave away the equivalent of like $250 billion in contemporary dollars, including he funded the construction of about 2,800 libraries around the world, and about 1,800, 1,700 are in the U.S. And he called the libraries palaces for the people, because the idea is that he was an immigrant to the U.S., and he was here at a time when a lot of immigrants were working in factories and living in tenement buildings. And the notion was like you would come to a library, and the library would be this thing that would kind of give you an exalted experience in the world. So he's from Pittsburgh, yes. So the libraries that are Carnegie libraries often have very high ceilings and big windows and big rooms. And the notion is that if you go there, you're supposed to feel like the sense of opportunity, right? And the library was literally like your palace where you could make something of yourself. It was central to his idea of how you could aspire to become something greater. It was his kind of philanthropic contribution to the public. And so, I was aware that like increasingly these days, the palaces that people get excited about are palaces like the Amazon 4-star store, but also that not too far from the Amazon 4-star store, there's a Carnegie Library. There's one in the Lower East Side in a neighborhood called Seward Park, which I like a lot. So my poor children, like, their father is a sociologist, which means that like when other parents are just doing kind of ordinary fun things like taking them to amusement parks and McDonald's, I'm thinking of social experiments that will make their lives more interesting. And so on this morning I decide, all right, so my son doesn't want to be with me when my wife is out. I've got my daughter. She's 10 and full of energy. We're going to do this thing. We're going to first go to the Amazon 4-star store, which sounds like this exciting new place. And then we're going to walk to the library, and we are going to compare those experiences, right? And so I'm so excited about this. I get her out the door because, like, who wouldn't want to go to the 4-star store? I'm really emphasizing the 4-star store as I talk to her. So we get there, and sure enough, like, it is buzzing with activity. There are tons of people around. Everybody seems like a little bit curious and happy, right? That's got that energy of a new store that opens up in Soho and lots of people around. And we walk around and they have all these amazing things, like, because everything had to have 4 stars, right? So like the vacuum cleaner that you don't have to push, like the what's it called, the Zumba or Rumba. Zumba's an exercise class. They have the thing anyway. It's like traveling all over the place, yeah. And all these good things going on, and they had lots of games. Very few books, unfortunately, for the book writers. But they also had a talking Chewbacca, which my daughter loved. It was an amazing, amazing Chewbacca. And what I realized is that in the 20 minutes or so that we spent in the store, my daughter, bless her, asked me for about $1,200 in stuff because there's just so much great stuff there. And, you know, that was actually okay until we got to the very end, in which she realized when I said, no, you're not getting anything, I really meant it. And that wasn't just because I'm a really difficult and ornery person. It's also that, like, I think there's this thing about public life when it's organized around very commercial activities, as so much of our public life is. And that is like you go shopping, you go to the new place, and it feels really fun at first, and then you realize that they want to take something from you, and they're asking you to spend money, and sometimes you don't have that money. Often you don't have that money, or not enough because there's so many things. And so there's always this strange feeling of organizing public life around commercial things, which is like it's uplifting and then a little bit hollow and frustrating too. And I thought we would have that experience. I didn't realize like what a profound experience of emptiness and hollowness we'd have at the end when she realized like all she could do was put the items on the list. But it was okay. So we were at the Amazon store, and the plan, okay, here's the plan. We were going to leave there. She was not going to get all the things she wanted. And then I'm going to walk her to my favorite library in Seward Park. And she's going to say, like, oh, Dad, that's the best graphic novel here. I love graphic novels. Can I have this? And I was going to say, of course you can. And then she's like, oh, they have this really cool game. Can we play this game? Yes, we can. Oh, can I have that, the video that we can like borrow and bring back? Yeah, you can. Yes to everything was the plan, right? And so I totally engineered this experience where, like, at the end of the day, as we meet, Dad, I love libraries and like all these big shops, they just want to take from you, right? I was so smart about this. And we went to Seward Park Library. It was like a 20-minute walk there. Seward Park's in the oldest municipal park, the first municipal park in the United States on the Lower East Side. It's a really special place because the Lower East Side is a neighborhood kind of like Chelsea a few decades ago, where we're sitting right now. Historically, a lot of poor people, a lot of immigrants. It's in the midst of a transition there. Like there's a lot of gentrification happening. Have any of you guys been to Seward Park or Lower East Side? Yeah. And like so. There's still like a lot of very poor people who use the library as like a great resource, but there's also people who will only get their coffee from coffee shops that don't accept cash because you can only pay for things with a credit card these days. Or like if you are the kind of person who likes to wake up in the morning on a weekend and feel like I want to find a place where I can spend $7 on an ice cream cone, Seward Park is an awesome place to do that. There's so many $7 ice cream cones. And so you feel the tension when you go to the neighborhood of this transition happening, right? And the library is this kind of nice middle ground where people come together. And I wanted her to see all that stuff. So I'm so pumped. Like we walk from Soho, we're walking east, having this great conversation. We get to Seward Park, walk to the library, and it's closed. Yeah. It's closed. Have you seen this talk before? No? Okay. That's good, because I'm just doing it now, so that would be very weird. You might have technology at Google where you can like fast forward while someone's speaking and see that I know you're working on that. So anyway, so we get, it not only is the library closed, but it's padlocked at the gate from outside the library, so we can't even get anywhere near it. Now, I spent just about every day for a year in public libraries doing work on this book. And I should have known that the library was closed because, why was the library closed? Do you know why? It was Sunday, right? And we say that as if like God decreed that on Sunday the library would be closed. And that was kind of the way that my daughter looked at things. Like I asked her, why do you think it's closed? And she's like, it's Sunday, Dad. It's like everybody knows that on Sunday, like we rest and people go to church and everything, things that are like these public city things, they just don't happen on Sunday. And I was like, oh yeah, that's right, my daughter's so smart, I'm very proud of her, she's only 10 and she knows that. And then I realized that that is true now, but it's not that things are closed on Sunday because God ordained it. It's that for the last many years, libraries and other big public institutions that used to draw us together are closed because we don't give them enough money in the public sector to stay open. And so the default option that all of us have on the weekend is that instead of going to shared places that are part of the public realm, we go to places that are in the private sector, the commercial enterprises that ask something from us, right? We pay to be part of public life. And I know that because when I started doing research on the history of libraries, one of the things I discovered is that libraries actually used to be busiest on Sundays. Sundays were booming days for libraries. Why is that? Because on Sundays, a lot of people don't work, right? It's a great day to be with your family, with your children, with your neighbors. It's a day to rest and to read and to come together. And there's nothing we've ever engineered that does that as well as a library, right? And so people used to roll into libraries. They were booming. And not just on Sundays, like at night, 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. There's a late night culture where families would go and be together because people worked during the day, and that was the opportunity. And now we close those things down as a matter of course, not because God ordained it, but because we have for decades made a decision not to invest in the things that I've come to consider in my work social infrastructure. Okay? And libraries are a very special kind of social infrastructure, but they are by no means the only one. What do I mean by social infrastructure? By social infrastructure, I am referring to the physical places that shape the way we interact. And when we invest in social infrastructure, when we build them up, when we design them well, when we take care of them, we are far more likely to engage other people around us, whether it's friends or family or neighbors or strangers who we encounter. We're more likely to do it frequently and in pleasant conditions. At the same time, if we don't invest in social infrastructure, we're all the more likely to wind up hunkering down, staying home, being alone, getting our source of social satisfaction from the machines that we carry with us in our pocket everywhere we go, right? And the social infrastructure, by the way, it's not a metaphor. It's a real thing. I've come to believe that the social infrastructure is just as real as the infrastructure for communication or for water or for power. It's literally this kind of material, physical foundation that shapes our social lives. And I first got to know what social infrastructure is and came to understand it years ago. I was working on a book about a heat wave in Chicago, which is the city that I grew up in. And there was this incredible heat wave that happened there in 1995. Hundreds of people died. And one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to look at why some neighborhoods seem to break down and have catastrophic outcomes and why others did really well. And the kind of first order answer to that problem is one that will not interest anybody here. Obviously, poor neighborhoods that have a lot of concentrated disadvantage, old people, frail people, sick people, those neighborhoods are going to do worse than affluent neighborhoods where people have resources and are healthy, right? There's no Nobel Prize for me, no magical job offer at Google at the end of this talk, because I've blown your minds with the scientific observation that vulnerable people die most in a disaster, right? Anybody want to hire me? Still no. But what was really interesting and scientifically puzzling, and this is why I wrote my first book about this, is that it turns out there's a bunch of neighborhoods in Chicago that are similarly poor, that have similar levels of segregation, that demographically are just about identical, and many of them are separated by one street. And if you looked at them on paper, you wouldn't think anything other than that these neighborhoods would have the same experiences. But during the heat wave, it turns out there were places imagine there was a line that went through this table and bisected the room, and everybody on this side of the table was like everybody on this side of the table in all the demographic ways that we conventionally measure. But on this side of the table, nobody died in the heat wave. In fact, you did better than the most wealthy neighborhoods in all of Chicago. And on this side of the table, it was a catastrophe. Massive numbers of people died and got sick, and there were deaths of isolation because people were literally baking to death at home, not going out. And so that was really interesting, right? And that was scientifically puzzling. And I spent a lot of time in Chicago trying to figure out, what was going on here. And the answer turned out to be that the neighborhoods like this that were really protected were places that had this booming social infrastructure. They had robust street life. The sidewalks were well taken care of. They had very little housing loss, very little population abandonment. So you had real density. There was kind of a dynamic commercial sector, shops, nonprofits, institutions like libraries that draw people out into public life. And what that meant for people in that neighborhood is that they're more likely to go outside just casually to interact with neighbors on a regular basis. And when there was a crisis, this heat wave, it was very easy for them to do the same thing, and that wound up being very protective. But on the other side of the room, you guys over there, you picked the wrong side of the room to sit on, people. I'm very sorry for you, because here, neighborhoods like this, a lot of abandoned houses, a lot of empty lots that discourage people from going outdoors. It can be very dangerous, we know from a lot of research that I write about in this book. fewer nonprofit organizations, less active religious organizations, public sector institutions like libraries not as present or well run. To the extent that they're parks, they tended to be more abandoned, just separated by a street. These are neighborhoods with tens of thousands of people, but a street bisects them, right? And here what that meant is people less likely to spend time in public settings, getting to know the people around them, more likely to have a small network, to get isolated, to die in the heat wave. And I literally studied neighborhoods where like the death rate was 10 times higher on this side than on this side. And there's one pair of neighborhoods I found, and actually a couple pairs like this, where the life expectancy on this side of the street was 5 years longer than the life expectancy across the streets. And that was not about the characteristics of the population. That was about the social infrastructure. So any of you here for Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy? You guys were around for that? So I was here, and I've been doing a lot of research on this question about how social infrastructure works and why it matters. And after Sandy, I realized that a bunch of similar patterns were happening in New York City. But also in New York, Sandy occasioned a real public reckoning around, what do we do now as we start to think about how to rebuild our cities, our communities, our regions to face the kinds of problems we face in the 21st century. Things like climate change, right? Higher rising seas, bigger storm surge, but other issues as well. And I run this thing called the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and we were doing a lot of programming around Sandy and the future of New York City. And I had started writing some articles for magazines about how to think about this kind of infrastructure crisis that we were facing here. And one day I got this call out of the blue from a member of the Obama administration who said, look, we have about $50 billion in federal aid for Sandy that came from Congress, and we've cordoned off a few $1 billion for a special competition we call the Rebuild by Design competition. You might not know this, but ordinarily the way that FEMA operates is that if you're going to get relief for a disaster from FEMA, the FEMA regulations say you can't build anything that's better than what was there before. You can only build things up to the standards that were there before, because the federal government is suspicious of local governments trying to take advantage of federal largesse, right? And so we say, you can't kind of pretend that something's wrong and improve, but think about what that means in the wake of a hurricane for a region that's facing rising seas. Okay, you can build a seawall, but only up to 4 feet. But sea level rise means it's not going to work. Sorry, you can't do that. So the Obama administration said, we're going to have to do things really differently. And they began this process by setting aside funds for this design competition that they called Rebuild by Design. And the idea is that they invited teams from all over the world to submit applications to be part of this process. 148 teams applied, some of the world's biggest engineering firms and great architects, Rem Koolhaas's firm and Bjarke Ingels' firm, and a lot of Starchitect names that you would recognize. I'll put in for this, and they asked me if I'd be the research director for this, and that was a really cool opportunity because I don't know a ton about the engineering of hard infrastructure systems like seawalls and power grids, but what I've come to really understand is the power of social infrastructure and its capacity to shape our experiences, whether it's in a neighborhood or in a workplace, right? Where how things are designed and built and what kinds of gathering places we have really shape the quality of our day, right? And potentially the quality of our work as well. So I got to work with these teams, and the idea that I really impressed upon the teams, there were 10 finalists in the end, and they had to go through a 9-month process before they could come up with a design proposal that would potentially get funded or not get funded by the feds. And the idea I insisted upon to these teams is that they recognize that the systems that they were building to deal with these 21st century challenges could do multiple things. That if they were originally intended to keep the water out, they should also think about how they would shape social life around it. And it was important to impress that point upon them, the idea that you're designing social infrastructure and not just hard infrastructure, because I don't know how many of you remember what the engineers and the scientists and the people concerned about climate change in New York City were saying New York City needed to do after Sandy. But the leading proposals for how to rebuild this region were organized around this phrase. Tell me if you recognize this phrase. The phrase that everybody was saying after Sandy, what New York City needed to do was build a wall. You recognize that phrase? Does that sound familiar? Build a wall was the big proposal, and I, if I were using all the technology, I would show you these design ideas for like giant seawalls that would go where the Verrazano Bridge is now. Other ideas about building hard infrastructure that would keep the water out and keep New York City safe. But there's lots of problems with building hard infrastructure, especially things like walls, which turn out not to work for water or for people. Like one of the problems that I learned is that if you build a seawall to try to keep water out of a place like New York City, and by the way, we're talking like from the floodplain here. I think we're like the Google complex sits very close to where water could easily come in, not just in New York City, but also if you're watching in Mountain View, you guys are even more vulnerable. So hi. But these are really serious issues. So if you build a wall, seawalls are designed to kind of open and close, and the idea is you want to keep them open as much of the time as possible. You only close them when you really need it. But if the sea levels are rising, then you potentially need to keep that wall closed more. And probably not everybody in the room is familiar with the fact that like on the other side of the Verrazano is this massive ecosystem that turns into the Hudson River, right, and the Hudson River Valley. And if you just like build a wall and shut the water off from coming out, that has massive consequences for that ecosystem, right? So you can't make these decisions glibly. The other thing is, and this is probably going to blow your minds because I didn't know this was true until I started working on this project, but okay, let's say you want to build a wall to protect Manhattan and New York City. You might want to make sure you're like solidly sitting down, because it turns out that right across the river from us is a whole entire place called New Jersey. And it's a big state. There's a lot of people there, and they have their own infrastructure and their own housing and their own set of issues. And if you build a wall to protect New York City, it's not like the water just evaporates when it hits it, right? It goes to New Jersey, okay? So, and there's sediment, right? And so it creates problems. You can't just ask for federal money to protect New York City at the expense. So let's say then we feel for our neighbors in New Jersey, and they've entered the age of reason now, and they want to play ball with us. We want to do regional planning, so we throw New Jersey into the plan, okay? Have you guys ever kept going south? So there's all these things keep popping up. There's Delaware, right? Maryland. Anyone here been to Maryland, right? Virginia. I'm getting better at this geography thing. It's like North Carolina, South Carolina. Did you guys know that Georgia actually gets all the way to the coast over there? There's like so you tell me, like, where do you want to stop the wall? Right? This turns out to be really a big challenge. And so, like, we can't just, I guess what I'm saying is we face big challenges, and putting up walls is not much of an answer. So I told these teams, like, okay, think about designing systems that are both hard infrastructure to do what you want, but also social infrastructure. Like, if you're going to build a levee, for instance, think about the activities that could happen on top of a levee. So the big plan that emerged for the Lower East Side, which is getting funded with about $1.5 billion of public money right now, designed by Bjarke Engels and his big team, is like, instead of a wall on the Lower East Side, it's a kind of a sloped bridging berm that's going to have parkland and bike paths and walking paths. It's really going to transform the feel of the Lower East Side. All right, it's a big idea to do something like that, and very different to build social infrastructure. So there's one day when I was walking around with this design team, and they had done all this amazing work in Louisiana after Katrina, and they're working on a plan for the region. And they said, Eric, we've been listening to you talk about social infrastructure and how important it is to design, physical places that can bring people together. And we have come up with a whole new prototype for a design concept that we're calling the Resilience Center. And we want to tell you about it. We're so excited about this. We think this Resilience Center, we're going to prototype it in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It's got a lot of very poor communities. And we think we're going to be able to scale it up and potentially like put it in cities and maybe neighborhoods all over the country. And I said, that sounds like an amazing thing. Like, who wouldn't want to hear about the Resilience Center, right? So tell me about it. And they said, okay, so here's the idea with the Resilience Center. We're going to have a building that's like very nicely designed for social life. It's going to be a very like welcoming place with flexible space, and we're going to put it in this neighborhood and potentially put them everywhere. And the building is going to be open as much as we can possibly afford to get support to keep it open, like hopefully 6 days a week, maybe even 7. And it's going to be staffed by people who are like aggressively welcoming. You know, their job is going to be to make everybody feel at home, and we can have little kids come in, because we know like from the things you've told us about vulnerability that in neighborhoods, the people who are really tied to the place where they live are very young people and very old people, right? There's a lot of like middle-aged people who are bouncing around the city, going all over the place, but very young people and older people, like it really matters where they live and what the facilities are like, what the conditions are like. Social infrastructure matters. So this Resilience Center, it's going to have all these programs that make it clear that kids are welcome. Like we'll do story times, and we'll do singing events, and we'll have all sorts of like meetups where kids in the neighborhood can meet each other. And we know that you can't have things for kids unless you have things for their caretakers. So it could be parents, it could be grandparents, it could be babysitters, whomever. But we want to make sure that there's things that bring families together. And I've also written a lot about the fact that there's more older people living alone in the world today, and they're really at risk of getting isolated in things like heat waves and hurricanes and in everyday life as well. So they said the Resilience Center is going to have lots of special things for older people that make it attractive too. And because resilience is so much about communication and cohesion, we want to make sure that people have really good media access when they come in here. So we're going to like wire them up with Wi-Fi access, and we'll have computers. And we really just see this as a special kind of idea that that will transform life in every neighborhood. What do you think? And I said to them, wow, that sounds like an awesome idea. And then I also said, have you ever been to a library? And it was like, whoa, actually they had just like reinvented the wheel, kind of. And why had they done that? I mean, I think partly it's because we do live in this moment where we tend to think that the biggest problems that we face can be solved with either technology or the marketplace, And not long, after this happened, there's actually an economist who wrote an article in Forbes saying that libraries had become obsolete and they were no longer worth the public investment. He said, show me the cost-benefit analysis that cashes out the value of the library as a public good. He said, instead of libraries, we should knock them all down, and we should open up Amazon stores. He didn't even know about the 4-star store. He just said we should open up Amazon stores. And it's interesting. I guess I understood where that was coming from, because the truth is, like, if you go to the boardrooms of the biggest companies in the world, possibly with the exception of this fine one. If you go to the people who are running the US government right now, like imagine talking to people in the cabinet, if you go to people who run big philanthropies and you talk about the places where people gather and the essential institutions that bring us together as citizens and as human beings that allow us to bridge divisions, I think very few people think of the library. I think the truth is that for many people, the library is an afterthought. It feels like an antiquated institution. Who would go there? But we actually learned from the response to this Forbes article just how out of sync with American culture that perspective is, because so many people actually tweeted a response, like the librarians of the world united and got on Twitter and shouted down this article so hard that Forbes actually took it down 24 hours after it posted it, which is an amazing thing. And what people did is that, they didn't just like give them the finger digitally, which is generally what happens on Twitter. They wrote like very compelling testimonies to the things that happen in libraries. And I realized that there's really a story that we need to tell that's not just about what happens in libraries, but also what happens in other kinds of shared spaces, gathering places, that gives us a chance to move forward and potentially even to make some headway working through what seems now to be a real impasse in our collective life. Right? Like, I don't know how you guys feel about this, but from my perspective, it's kind of a scary moment out there. I do often have this feeling like things are falling apart. Like it's very hard to read contemporary politics and read into the state of civil society in places like the United States today, not just the United States, but many places just like the United States, and see a clear path forward to a better, more robust civil society and democracy. The truth is, we're talking together, in early 2019, and probably no one in this room feels supremely confident that, 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, our democracy, our civil society will look the way it does right now. We're being tested, right? So I don't have the illusion that building libraries all over the country is going to solve all of our problems. I wish I could come to you and say, like, I've solved the problem of democracy and polarization, and it's the library. I don't feel that way, although I will tell you something. I've traveled all around the world and spent time in the kind of big grand libraries, but also the little branch libraries that you find in neighborhoods. And I've certainly traveled across the country and seen them in rural areas, in suburban areas, in suburbs and cities, in red states and blue states. And I will tell you that there are not a lot of institutions like them that bring people from different backgrounds together for shared activities that are like very human and very deep and very meaningful and full of potential. And what I do think is that there are a set of places that are vital social infrastructures that are like libraries, places like parks and playgrounds, or athletic fields, schools that open their doors and create place for community. Actually, workplaces can be like this too. They're places that allow us, encourage us to come together and engage with people that we might not otherwise engage with. And I don't know if you share this experience, but I find that when I'm in a place like a library or even an athletic field or a park, and I find myself talking to someone or interacting with someone who has different feelings than I do, like, it's a much more peaceful disagreement than it is when I meet someone that way on Twitter, where we go from 0 to 60 very, very fast. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how do we begin to rebuild? How do we not just rebuild after a storm, a climate event, but how do we start to rebuild after the kinds of storms that we're experiencing in our civic life? Like, how do we start to put pieces together again? And I don't think that building a library is the solution, but I don't see a better starting point than investing in places like libraries, in shared places that encourage us to come together for more peaceful interactions. I don't see any other way to start to move forward. And one of the things that's very interesting is to note that there are possibilities for developing social infrastructure at the public level that involve kind of collective investment in these projects. And personally, I don't see a way to kind of get out of the situation we're in without those kinds of investments. But I also think there's a role to play for philanthropy and for the private sector as well. So if you think about what's going to happen in New York City, where we're standing over the next several years, for instance, there's going to be a lot of private sector investment in remaking our neighborhoods, right, and remaking the cityscape. And the way in which that investment happens, the kinds of shared spaces that we build, whether they're walls or bridges, is going to make a tremendous difference for those of us who live here, right, and want to raise families here, and who try to make a neighborhood something that's a community. Those decisions are really significant. So I'm going to start to wrap up so we can have a conversation, but I want to wrap up by saying the following. We keep hearing about Infrastructure Week and how that's going to happen. So the government is rather distracted, although it's at the moment completely closed. So Infrastructure Week has not been happening, and it probably will not happen, and it's probably a good thing that it's not going to happen in the next couple of years. But at some point, it is inevitable that we will have not just Infrastructure Week, but Infrastructure Era, because the systems that we rely on to live in modern society simply don't work anymore. right? And I'm saying that to a room full of people who've probably taken the subway enough to know that that's true. But the systems, you pick your system type. They're out of date. They were built at another moment with different technology. They're worn down, and they're clearly not up to the kinds of challenges we face in the 21st century. Currently, the biggest and boldest idea for infrastructure that we have from our government is the wall. And unfortunately, it's also the most antisocial infrastructure that one could possibly imagine, right? It's a losing strategy. We also have a vision for infrastructure that comes out of the tech sector. And specifically, in this case, it comes from Facebook. I don't know if you guys are on Mark Zuckerberg's holiday mailing list like I am, but as a member of one of his clubs, I get letters from him occasionally after big events. And after the election in 2016, Mark sent his 2 billion friends a letter saying, don't worry, guys. It may be true that the traditional meeting places that people have used are doing less well than they used to, but Facebook is here to be your social infrastructure. And he used that language, and the argument was, you can come to Facebook for meaningful social interactions and meaningful community life. And the suggestion was, you guys have your devices, and we're really going to help you rebuild the special communities. I am not against the devices, okay? Like, I have one here. I don't like to leave without it. It makes me uncomfortable and nervous. I'm on all the social media things. I'm not a Luddite. But I've also been to the Facebook campus. Have any of you guys been to the Facebook campus in Menlo Park? They probably are never letting you guys in. There's a couple guys in the back. Like, yeah, right? But the Google campus is not that much different. Like, let me tell you that no living human being has invested as much money in physical social infrastructure as Mark Zuckerberg, maybe Larry and Sergey, sorry guys, maybe the people running Apple. But like, Silicon Valley tech firms understand the value of social infrastructure. Have you guys ever been outside of this room in your office? It's crazy out there, right? I walked by a spa, just to get here. There's free food everywhere. I started eating bananas. Someone came in and wanted to massage me to make sure like I was ready for coding. Like, you guys work in a worker's paradise that's designed to make you want to be here, right? It's designed to help you be as productive as you can possibly humanly be, right? It's designed to help you bump into people who are brilliant and awesome in places where you wouldn't expect to meet, right? Like over the kale salad bar or the, right, Sambuca club, I don't know, weekly meeting or whatever it is that you do. Like, it's all designed so you have the experience of being with each other. And it's a really dynamic and exciting place. That's done with a physical investment in social infrastructure. You guys can do better. And one of the really big questions for Google in California, that's telling me it's time for Q&A. One of the really good investments for Google to be thinking about in California and in New York is like, how do you build a social infrastructure that works for Googlers and that also works for the region and the neighborhood, the city that Google's embedded in, right? Because I don't want my only experience to Google being like, oh, there's this whole building that they just took over and I'm never going to go in there again unless I write a book, And then I get an hour and a banana. So like, how is Google going to contribute to the social infrastructure of New York? It's not fair to say it's just going to happen with your machine while we build these awesome places for ourselves, right? And so the vision that I'm proposing to you is a vision that takes seriously the physical places where we live and where we work and spend time with one another. And the question that I guess I want to ask of you is to think seriously about how Google can contribute to this neighborhood and the city, or if you're in Menlo Park right now, or Los Altos, or Sunnyvale, or San Jose, that city, those neighborhoods, what's Google's contribution to our collective and shared social infrastructure going to be? To what extent are the future social infrastructures of our world going to look like libraries? And to what extent are they going to look like walls? So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for questions. I have a mic, which I guess I'm going to hand to you. and you can just pass it around.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's also really great to just watch you and not some slides while you're giving a talk. And I play soccer at Seward Park, and I think the whole place, if you haven't been there, feels a bit like a social experiment. I've never been anywhere else in New York that has such high levels of just social interaction and collaborate, like buzzing with activity. But I wanted to ask, so I am part of the Growth Google team as well, and we are actually this spring opening up a physical space in our New York office, a learning center for the community, for partners within our community, to bring digital skills training to the community that we're a part of. And I guess with that idea, where we're trying to open our doors for social interaction and community building, and really being a physical space for, kind of everything that you're speaking of. What would your advice be to us to make sure that we do that successfully?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so happy that you're going to do that because I've been looking for someone who would teach me how to do GIFs in Twitter. And
we can do that.
Can I get that? Do you cover that?
I think so, yeah.
Awesome.
Well, 101.
So, no, look, I mean, the real issue is how do you make sure that people feel like they're genuinely invited and wanted and welcome? Because I've seen this in time after time when a corporation moves in and grudgingly puts in kind of public space because they have to get like the proper zoning and permitting, and they promise the city, they'll do that for the community, but give everyone reason to believe that they're not really wanted there, it doesn't really work, and people read that. Or I've seen cultural institutions like new museums and art galleries come in and say, we want to be a part of the neighborhood, and so like it's going to be free here on Fridays, from 6 to 10 or whatever, every Friday is free or free for a neighborhood, and people don't come. And they think, like, well, why? We made it free. Unfortunately, often the only way you get a successful public space in a place that is known to be private and for insiders is if you very aggressively do outreach and make sure that people around you know that you really mean it, that you're really there for them. And that means understanding in every place where you build something like this, like what are the big community organizations? Who are the local leaders? Where's their vulnerability? How can we address some of those things? Is there something it's not like Field of Dreams, You can't just build it. You really have to do more. And where I can see the commitment of different organizations to that doing more is when I look at like how they're staffing those programs. Like who are they hiring? How much time are they dedicating to really making those things work? And we live at a time when I think everyone knows that you kind of have to walk through the motions to get some things publicly approved. But not everybody knows that they're really wanted. And so if you come to a neighborhood and you make that genuine commitment, I think people will be impressed. And I've seen companies like Google do it well, and I've seen companies like Google swing and miss. So I hope you do it well.
Thank you.
Thanks. I'd like to follow up on the fact that you described we have those wonderful workspaces at Google and Facebook, and that contributes to that social infrastructure. Those things are not easily scalable and replicable because, one, they cost a lot of money, but also they're not perfect, right? Even in a workplace like those tech companies, yes, we run into each other as employees, but there's a gap between us and the people who maintain those spaces and serve us, and we don't feel like really a community in that sense. So the physical space is not a miracle on its own, right? It's one ingredient. And I'm wondering, do you see that technology can help providing this social infrastructure on its own without having to rebuild stuff around us? And now, for example, I've been living in this New York building for 10 years and I hardly know my neighbors, right? Okay, we have doors which are separating us. If we take down those doors, most likely there's going to be a better community. But do you think technology can do something to bring us together in the physical world?
Very much. Absolutely. I mean, so I wrote this book with a comedian about dating, and we talked a lot about online dating, and clearly it's much easier to find dates, with Tinder than it was before Tinder existed, or OkCupid or Bumble or whatever it is that you're doing now. And still, like, some people spend too much time online and not enough time dating, right? Because it's easier just to be in the phone swiping left and right than it is to actually do the date. But do I think that the internet can help to bring people together? Yes. Let me give you 2 examples of things that I think are really awesome. For very local neighborhood kinds of things, like Nextdoor is a very smart, I don't know, do I call it an app or a website? Well, I'm going to call it an app. I like the way that it is oriented towards helping people make connections with people around them to solve common problems or to share. And it seems to me like it's a very effective tool. My family and I moved to Silicon Valley a few years ago for a year. And it was really striking how much people relied on Nextdoor there because the scale of the place made it work really well. It doesn't work too well on 15th Street, but it could probably. It just, you get swamped. The other thing is, like last year, very unfortunately, I had 3 very dear friends get cancer. And have any of you used this website, Caringbridge? Do you know about Caringbridge, which allows you to build a community around someone's care? So, someone you know gets very sick. Someone else or that person starts a Klinenberg program where the person can explain what's going on with them, or their primary caretaker can explain, or anyone who's authorized to post can post. You can use it to organize like who's going to deliver meals, who's going to visit the hospital, how to support one another. And I can't tell you how powerful this website was in allowing me to understand what my friends were going through and figure out how to be a better friend and better supporter, not just to the sick person, but also to the people who are on the front lines of care, which can also be exhausting. And I thought, like, that's a genius technology. And I actually don't need to be face-to-face with those people all the time, but like the connection through stories and sharing information on Klinenberg worked really well. Those for me work much better than Twitter or Instagram or Facebook even. Or Google Hangouts. Do you guys still have that? I don't know. It just, those technologies don't work as well. So I think there are cases in which, not having the face-to-face thing can do a lot of good. But for the most part, what I look for from technology is something that's going to make it easier and more likely that I will meet up with someone face-to-face. And I think there's a real value in recovering that kind of face-to-face interpersonal experience. It tends to generate a level of depth and meaning and significance that makes us all feel more satisfied and more human. And when we spend too much time with our machines, I think we tend to feel alienated from ourselves. At least that's my experience. I don't know how you guys experience it. But everybody I know is trying to solve the problem of how to spend less time with their machines and more time with other people. Yeah, there's a question in the back.
Hi, Eric. I'm curious to know, what do you think the role of religious institutions are in the social infrastructure? And then another question related to that is, do you think there's a causal factor that is cause for the decline in both libraries and religious institutions?
So I do think there's a role for religious organizations and for other nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations in the social infrastructure. I think we have such profound deficits in our social infrastructure, and given the nature of inequality, I think our only real hope for addressing the deficiencies in social infrastructure is to do more public investment. But that said, and it's a realm of democratic politics where we have some collective say as citizens and voters. But that said, how could you go to England and not recognize that the pub, which is a for-profit institution, is a central part of the social infrastructure, right? Or how could you go to an African-American neighborhood in Chicago where I grew up and not see that the beauty salon, right, or the barber shop is a key place, and those are for-profit institutions. And the diner, things like that. Religious organizations, classic social infrastructure. In fact, the chapter in my book that's about climate change as a problem of building a collective to manage something collaboratively begins with the story of an evangelical church in Houston that made a principled commitment to be a multi-ethnic, multiracial community, and because of its strengths and long, deep ties, was able to do tremendous work in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. 1.5 years ago. And so I think like religious organizations can play a central role. Now the issue with religious organizations and also with private sector places is that they have the capacity to get exclusive. In some cases they're exclusive by definition, and that means like they might not serve everyone. They might help only members of a group. And in some cases, like you might have a religious group that says like principally it will help people in its group and exclude others. And it turns out this church in Houston did the opposite, even during this event, which was great. But they're very exclusive religious organizations, as we know, of all varieties. And then you guys all know the story of like what happened in Starbucks in Philadelphia this past summer, right? Do you remember that experience? Like a lot of people say like Starbucks is a like a third space. It's like practically like a public space now, right? Except for that in Philadelphia this past summer, these two African-American guys went to meet a friend. And has this ever happened to you? Like you go to a place to meet a friend and your friend is late? Has anyone had that experience ever? You're like, no, that's never happened to me. So their friend is late and they're waiting. And I was just giving a talk at a university a few weeks ago and I asked the students if they knew about the story and what happened. And one student was like, yeah, I know what happened. They kicked him out. And I thought to myself, it would have been such a great thing if they had just kicked him out. If they had said, please, gentlemen, we have a rule here that you have to order if you're going to sit in Starbucks, so we invite you to come and buy one of our coffees. Or like, worse would have been to say, like, I'm sorry, you have to leave. But instead, I'm bringing you with me everywhere I speak from now on. They said, they called the police, right? They called the police on these guys, and it kind of like, because it was captured on video, it conveyed this fact that all of us know and many of us experience, which is that like private spaces, nonprofit or for-profit, can be inaccessible, right? And in Seward Park, it's like if you don't have a credit card, you can't go to Grumpy's for coffee. But the truth is, like, I could be a 70-year-old Chinese immigrant or native-born person who's lived my life in Seward Park, and I know that Mission Chinese is not for me, and that I'm not really wanted in Mission Chinese, right? Like, the buildings themselves, the stores, the companies, like, they tell you who's welcome and who's not welcome. It's very clear to us. We can all read that kind of thing. So the trick for these places is to make themselves as accessible as possible, right? To signal as much as possible that people are welcome. Now, not every place has to be a democratic social infrastructure, but if we want them to be like social infrastructures, they have to do that. Is there like a single line that's causing the decline in religious membership and also the decline in libraries? I think there are different lines probably. And actually, religious institutions in the U.S. are surprisingly robust. I mean, it's true that I think church participation is probably not what it once was. But there's a tremendous number of people in this country who keep on going to church. Libraries, I want you to know, are buzzing with activity. I mean, the library usage rates are soaring. And it might be the case that people don't take out books as much, right? But like, who other than you guys who are going to be so involved reading my book for the next few weeks is actually reading a book right now? I mean, we live in a different cultural moment and people are consuming information in different ways. But people are using libraries in all these amazing ways that I hadn't expected. So it like remains a place where early literacy education happens. And libraries are teaching more people English as a second language than any other public institution. They're doing citizenship classes. They're providing connection and companionship for older people. They're places where people get free Wi-Fi access. And people learn how to use computers. It's actually really interesting to see how many people kind of don't know how to do email and go to the library and have the librarian help them with email. But librarians are solving all kinds of problems, and enormous numbers of people are using them, in part because we haven't supported other social infrastructures or invested enough in other protected programs. And so if you spend time in a neighborhood library, I think what you'll observe is that libraries are overrun, actually. And it's one reason that I have been hoping that some great philanthropist or political leader will make the kind of commitment to the library that Carnegie made 100 years ago. Because we don't have that vision yet. We have not had a compelling leader make the case that the solution to our crisis in civil society is to make a major investment in shared spaces. And until that happens, I think we're going to stay very much in the crisis that we have now. Are we going to end on that sad note? I want to end on a happier note, like free ice cream across the hall.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah.